Welcome back. Today's episode is going to be very interesting. This is the podcast for intercultural competence through virtual exchange as a tool in achieving the SDGs. And today we have two panelists that are going to talk about their research on promoting sustainable development through service learning as an international virtual exchange. We have today Maggie Workman and Isadore Udoh. I will ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and where they're located and their titles, and then we'll get started. Professor Workman, would you like to go first?
Hello, my name is Margaret Workman, and I am an instructor at the Department of Environmental Science and Studies at DePaul University.
Dr. Udoh?
Yes, and my name is Isadore Udoh. I am an associate professor at Northeastern Illinois University in the Department of Health Sciences and Physical Education. So I teach classes in public health, in global environmental health, and health disparities.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to our podcast today. To get started, would you like to explain how this virtual exchange came about and the focus on energy that it has? Professor Workman?
I'll start and then Maggie can talk about the energy. We began the initial engagement with this university, the University of Udoh in Nigeria, in 2016. So I met the professor in their law faculty in 2016, and then we began to talk about the possibility of implementing a virtual exchange between the law school at that University of Udoh and then the Master of Public Health program at DePaul University. So the first virtual exchange that we had happened in 2018 between the law school at the University of Udoh, using their class in international public law, and then our program here at DePaul University, the master's degree program in public health, using our course in public health and forced migration. So subsequently, we did teach other virtual exchange programs, including the recent one we did on climate change, and then looking at the impact of energy exploitation and marketing, and then utilization on environmental health. So Maggie will talk about the energy part of that virtual exchange.
So one of the major causes of the forced migration in Nigeria, I believe, is the energy industry. And so we decided to do a whole virtual exchange just on the impacts of energy, which included these social issues like the forced migration, but also looked at impacts on economics, the impacts on obviously the environment, and the impacts on just the communities, as a whole. So it kind of expanded from their initial global learning experience project.
And we should mention who were your other global partners. You had several partners that worked on this research with you.
Yes, so our partners were Isadore Udoh from the University of Udoh. That is the professor from the law school that Isadore worked with, and I worked with Paul Ani from the University of Udoh, and our global partner for the service learning component was Edward Obi from Gas Alert for Sustainable Initiatives in Nigeria.
Excellent. And for our audience, I think before we go too much further, can you talk about what is service-based learning?
So Isadore and I went to Nigeria to prepare for the virtual exchange class, and we met with a lot of the community groups. And I think that's one of the major parts of service learning is starting from the community to see what sort of issues they are having, and then how the students could become a part of that. So one of the things that we found during our many discussions with different community groups, we met with dozens of community groups and went to their, if they had a location or they showed us some sites, was the impact of the oil industry that's in Nigeria. And so then we decided to have the students collect data on the impacts of the oil industry on things like oil, on air, water, the soil, economics, and so on, because the one thing that they really needed was data to support their advocacy. And so the students were helping by providing some of this data that was needed. So service learning, I really think, starts with the community, the needs of the community, and how the students can work into that need.
Outstanding. And as you went through and set up this virtual exchange, can you tell us a little bit more about what the students did and some of your observations?
Well, the students did very many things. We set up a platform that hosted all the virtual exchange activities, including the weekly discussions that were conducted via WhatsApp, and then other projects that we had, including the final project that was conducted via Google applications. So the student, we created discussion prompts and then provided those to students every week for three weeks out of the 6 weeks that we conducted the program. So for 3 weeks, we provided different prompts, and then the students discussed among themselves, the Nigerian students and the US students. They looked at different issues that affected the environment, including oil pollution, including the impact of that oil pollution on human development, the displacement of communities because of oil production, and then the trafficking that are happening, human trafficking that are happening as a result of oil production in that part of Nigeria. So at the end of the 6 weeks, students were advised to visit community groups that worked on issues of refugees and migration in Nigeria, and then to interview the leaders of these groups, and then report on what they said about the causes of human displacement, and then the relationship between oil production and human displacement, and how that affects the overall public health of communities in the oil-producing area of Nigeria. So I believe Maggie might have more to say about this.
Yeah, so my students did some data collecting. So they physically went out and collected soil samples and water samples and air samples And the ones who did economic impacts, they collected economic data and health data. One of the challenges for this project, I would say, at least for my students, was providing the testing materials. So we actually had to go out and get an external grant so that we could purchase all of the testing materials so the students had the same materials to be testing. So they actually went out with scientific test kits and did the soil testing and the water testing and the air testing. So it did require us to go out and get some external money and then send it to Nigeria. So the students all had the same equipment and had the same sort of shared experience.
That sounded outstanding from the student perspective to have these kinds of experiences. Can either of you talk about how did this impact the student? What observations did you have as instructors in how meaningful this experience was for your students?
Well, as a scientist, first, I would say that a lot of my students said, "Oh, I feel like a scientist," which I think for a lot of them was the first time they might have felt that way because most of the students, at least in this class, are taking it for a science credit and don't consider themselves scientists. So I love that, that they felt that they were scientists, but they also felt that they were doing something for a purpose. For example, we do a lot of soil testing and water testing in our labs in environmental science. But the students, basically we bring in water and they do the testing, they turn in their report, but they don't really see the purpose of what they're doing. And so they're doing the same thing, but it was for a purpose. And so I think that's why they really got excited was the purpose of what they were doing.
Mm.
And to add
Go
to
ahead.
that, to add to that, uh, my students felt that the virtual exchange helped them to um, more effectively communicate with people from other cultures. They were very excited that they have been reading about all these challenges in African countries, and they were now actually working with students from some of those places that they were reading about. So they said that they learned a lot about the cultures in Nigeria and then how um, those cultures respond to a crisis and challenges to human development. And then we noticed that the students demonstrated a good amount of empathy, like when they were comparing the experiences of refugees in the United States to the experiences of refugees or displaced persons in Nigeria. So the students were they were saying, "Oh my God, I understand exactly what you are saying because we have the same issues here with our government. The way the government in Nigeria is responding to the needs of displaced people. And then there were some similarities with the way the US government is also responding to the needs of immigrants and refugees in the United States. So the students were saying, "Oh, I understand exactly what you are saying because we have the same challenges, we have the same opportunities here in the United States."
That's really interesting because you start off as a virtual exchange between two countries and you're hoping to get intercultural, skill building, and as well as the disciplinary science learning outcomes. And you also get then this concept that you just brought up of empathy. And so in terms of empathy, I want to focus a little bit more on that. Can you give us some more examples? How did empathy come out? Did it come out in their conversations across the two countries, in their work products, in their discussion boards? How did you observe that empathy was taking place?
I really feel like the empathy and this cultural learning was probably the the greatest amount of learning that they did. They did obviously learn content material, but I think that had the biggest impact on the students. Um, in the WhatsApp chat, I would wake up sometimes in the morning and there would be a group that had 200, 200 messages back and forth in the one day. One time there was one that had like 400 comments.
Mm.
They really were chatting back and forth, learning from each other. That is one of the things that they learned so much was learning from each other and about each other. In terms of the environment, for example, the DePaul students would they knew, that oil spills or whatever had this impact on water or soil. But then hearing some actual experiences of people and how it impacted them, how it caused them to have to move, become a displaced person, was really eye-opening because they were firsthand accounts. And
Mhm.
then the students in Nigeria thought that in Chicago had absolutely no impact from fossil fuels. And they were super surprised to find that, students in Chicago were experiencing impacts. And so they really learned a lot about each other.
Mm. That's outstanding. And that's, something that perhaps you didn't fully anticipate in learning outcomes and design of the syllabus and the course. How about you, for the instructors? Can you give us some impact each of you as instructors? How did this virtual exchange impact both of you?
Well, for me, it was quite an eye-opening because I got to see for the first time, to experience for the first time how classes are organized in Nigeria and then in Nigerian universities, how the professors interact with students, how the students are evaluated, and then how the students relate with their professors. I would say that there is, in many ways, the observations were similar to what we are doing here in the United States, but in some ways, they were also different in the sense that the teaching method in Nigeria is more didactic, and then while here in the United States, um, professors work more collaboratively with students, and then there's a lot of project, and then there are experiential elements to learning here in the United States. But in Nigeria, what I observed was that most of the learning is done in the classroom, and then and most of it is uh, uh, done by the professor. Like it's very vertical. So the knowledge flows from the professor to the students in that direction. And then, whereas here in the United States, students feel a lot freer to building the body of knowledge. So, and then the way um, the professors were related to students in Nigeria was more like uh, this thing like a patronizing, I would say, in the sense that uh, the students were referring to the professors as ma, mommy, and then daddy, or something like that. But here in the United States, it is more informal, much more informal than the experience that I noticed in the Nigerian university, which is very structured and very hierarchical. and then students are expected to behave in a certain way, and then professors are expected to behave in a certain way in the process of learning.
Okay.
I feel that for me, it has had a big impact on my teaching and on my scholarship. First of all, I really think it has enriched my class. Um, Prior to the global learning, when we talked about, impacts of oil, I would have a PowerPoint slide that would say something like, impacts of oil, water pollution, soil pollution, economic, issues, something like that. And now I have firsthand stories, I've got pictures, um, I've got discussions, so it makes it all more real and more rich for the students. And then in terms of scholarship, I've been doing a lot of scholarship relating to this work, giving presentations at international conferences, writing this book chapter, writing journal articles. It's really broadened what I'm doing. I've always been in chemistry education and did a lot of work in pedagogy, and I just sort of incorporated this into that perspective, more on global learning, virtual learning, along with my sort of chemistry, education, pedagogy learning.
I think that message that both of you just highlighted is really important for other faculty to understand how virtual exchange can really enrich their own pedagogy and their own understanding interculturally of other nations. And so I find that something that is not always brought out in the literature. Well, is there anything in closing, any other takeaways you would like us to have before we close out?
I would also like to add that interacting with Nigerian students and the instructors from there showed me how the differences between the two societies in terms of availability of resources for professors and for students. So I noticed a lot of inequalities in terms of access to technology, in terms of access to print material, to books, and to other resources that the students need for learning. So the university did not have access to some of the databases that house the articles and other literature that the students would need. So the students had to reach out to us here to request for some print material for articles, and then I had to go on the DePaul library to get these articles and then send to those students. So whereas as students here in the United States, in Chicago, at DePaul University, they have access to most of the things they will need, to computers, to the library resources they will need for their learning. The Nigerian students did not have access to many of those things. And then that shows me that there is that imbalance in power and access to resources that made the virtual exchange very challenging. But then the virtual exchange provided an opportunity for the DePaul students here to see how blessed they are, that they have so many resources that are not available to students in other countries. And then it also provided an opportunity, even though it's a short opportunity for Nigerian students to to get many of the resources that they would otherwise not get, and then to enhance their learning by interacting with those resources.
That's a really good point. That's a very good point that I think many of us who have been doing virtual exchanges over the years have found that particular, I don't want to call it a barrier, but there is a differential in access to resources between many of the different nations.
Yeah, the students in Nigeria, this was a very important program for them, and they were really dedicated to the program. For instance, we did this during COVID when DePaul was meeting virtually. The university in Nigeria, they did not meet at all. There was just no college, learning for the whole year. However, we still did this program. The students still showed up to, to work on this program. So they did this on their own time. And a lot of the students, they don't have access to Wi-Fi, so they are using their own resources, like paying for data, and minutes on their phone and such. So it was really important, I think, for them that they showed up and they participated. So despite what he just mentioned, these issues, they showed up and did a great job. So
that's really outstanding. And that's a great point for us to end on. Thank you for spending time with us and talking about your particular virtual exchange. I think it was very important to hear the messages and experiences that you've encountered. Thank you so much.
thanks for having us.
Thank you.